Au nom du CERMAM, je vous souhaite la bienvenue. Merci d'être avec nous aujourd'hui pour un nouveau débat du CERMAM consacré cette fois-ci au 10e anniversaire du printemps arabe. Avant de donner la parole à Anas, je pense que vous ne connaissez pas Anas avant ce panel, et ben moi non plus. J'ai fait la connaissance de Anas il y a quelques années, donc je pense qu'il y a 4 ans, et on était dans un même panel lors d'un séminaire consacré justement à la situation en Libye. Il y avait à ma droite un Français, donc un chercheur français. Et donc, il y avait des intervenants qui parlaient en français, en anglais et en arabe. Et on avait la traduction simultanée. Et ce chercheur français à ma droite qui me connaissait, il me dit, mais vous avez présenté ce monsieur qui est à votre gauche, donc il parlait de Anas, comme Libyen. Je lui dis, oui, oui, il vient de Libye. Il me dit, mais il n'a pas besoin de traduction, lui. Je lui dis, non, il connaît l'arabe, le français et l'anglais. Mais en fait, ce qu'il disait, il a raison, parce que grâce au soulèvement libyen, il y a une parole qui s'est libérée. Tout le monde, vous, moi, on a découvert finalement des visages dans les télévisions, surtout arabes, mais même la télévision libyenne et dans les médias, des Libyens qui parlent un langage construit, qui analyse, etc. Et c'est vrai, parce que Qais al-Azzaoui nous disait toujours que lui, il était prof à Tripoli et le régime de Kadhafi a brûlé tous les livres sur la philosophie. Il a dit que la philosophie n'a pas lieu d'être et le seul livre qui était autorisé, c'était le livre vert. Et donc, Anas fait partie de ces voix, de ces jeunes chercheurs qui ont immergé grâce au soulèvement libyen. Et depuis, bien sûr, il porte sa voix. Il travaille sur la gouvernance, il travaille sur les réformes des systèmes de sécurité. Il a créé un centre de recherche en Libye qui s'appelle SADC, l'Institut Sader, Mahad Sadr. Il est invité régulièrement par le Collège de défense qui dépend de l'Alliance Atlantique à Rome. Et bientôt, il sera, m'a-t-il dit, chercheur invité à Carnegie. Anas El-Goumati, qui vient aussi d'une famille révolutionnaire, des Libyens qui sont opposés au régime, va nous parler aujourd'hui donc de la situation en Libye aujourd'hui même. Merci Anas d'avoir accepté. Tu peux évidemment, tu ne vas pas me décevoir, tu ne vas pas me dire que je ne comprends pas le français. Tu peux parler en français ou en anglais, ce n'est pas un
Merci.
problème. Yeah.
Merci, Hasni. I'm going to choose to speak in English.
Okay,
Hasni,
fine.
you're a dear friend. Thank you so much for the invitation. Thank you for the lovely introduction that only a very good friend can make, because we've spent so much time together over the last couple of years. So thank you for your invitation, and thank you to everyone else for their excellent presentations and their time this afternoon. It's a great conversation to have, because it's been such an interesting decade, and listening to the experiences in Tunisia, in Egypt, and in Syria, you begin to wonder what brings all of these countries together. Aside from the timing, the timing in 2011 and 2010 was interesting, but there is a thread that ties these countries together, and I think that's been the biggest issue. I think is the most simple issue. How do you define the Arab Spring? How do you define this in Libya? And I think we can try to measure it in similar ways to those in Tunisia, in Egypt and Syria, even though our experiences were very different. I would say that Libya presents an interesting example right in the middle, because it has certain particularities and characteristics that make it look like Egypt and Tunisia, and certainly characteristics that make it resemble Syria to a certain degree. So I would say today, when many people are looking at Libya, they find it complex, and they turn away for 5 minutes, and then it looks like everything has changed. So depending on how you view 2011, Libya is in its 10th year of conflict. If you view it differently, you could say it's the third civil war. If you view it even more different, you could just say that the last war started in April 2019. And it does not include the same actors that were there in 2011. NATO was the primary military actor in 2011, and a collection of Arab states intervened. Today, it's the Arab states, particularly, or the regional states, that are intervening in Libya. So how do you characterize what has happened over the last 10 years? I would say the most simple definition is that Libya, in the middle of the Arab Spring or the uprisings across the Middle East and North Africa, is probably the only state that is truly up for grabs, in the sense that there was a real political vacuum after 2011. And that vacuum is really the defining characteristics of the political character of the state. What I mean by that is that you have many different attempts to define the conflicts, define the revolutions. Is it Islamists versus secularists, which is a facet, it's one face of many of the micro conflicts across the Arab world, but it doesn't give you all of the color. You could say that Libya is a regional conflict because you have East, West, and South Libya, Tripolitania, Cyrenaica, and Fezzan. And there are many attempts to say, well, this is just, you know, the tribes and the different regions in Libya, all in the midst of a conflict for the past decade. You know, and I think that's not necessarily true either. You could also say that greed, because Libya has so much oil wealth, that all of the greed of the different actors is really the objective. And I would say that that's not also an accurate reading because of who came out to fight, when they started fighting, and when they stopped fighting. So I would say today that the main character, and to really thread and tie Libya to its neighbors, is that the political character of the state is still up for grabs. And what I mean by that is that many of the states that we're talking about, excluding Tunisia because it's quite particular in its own civil military relations, many of the states that we're speaking about, we're talking about power, essentially the relationship between the governor and the governed, and what that relationship looks like at its most basic level. That, I would say, is the character of the state. Are you living ultimately in civilian states that lean more towards a real democracy, not just elections, but a true sense of liberty, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, freedom of thought, the ability to change your power, to change the people in charge? Or are you living under military regimes? And military regimes have many faces. Some of them are staunchly military, like in Egypt. Some of them are constitutional monarchies or monarchies that are really controlled by the military. And I would say that Libya is in that one place in the entire Arab world where it's a blank slate. You still have this argument, you still have these two winds really coming from east and west across Libya that are trying to define that character of the state post-Gaddafi. And that is essentially how I would explain the current circumstances, because we often forget that the Arab Spring is about its people, you know, and it was led by its people, but it was also about the regional power. You know, regional powers across the region also looked at the Arab Spring as a crisis, as a destabilizing phenomena, and saw it as an opportunity in the way that perhaps Qatar did in the early moments of 2011 by promoting the Arab Spring. And you have states more like Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and latterly Egypt, that have also viewed this as a fear, as a nightmare that, you know, will essentially infect their populations and lead to more revolutions and more change and the overthrow and toppling of their authoritarian regimes. So I think, yes, you can always describe this as a democracy versus authoritarianism, but it is about power and the form of power. And I would say today, when we look at Libya, since its third war in 2019, where today we have a UN peace process or a political process that is trying to marry two different arms of the state, the Libyan National Army or the Libyan Arab Armed Forces controlled by Khalifa Haftar, and the Government of National Accord that was brought in by the UN 5 years ago, and is trying to marry them at political levels, at economic levels, and at military levels. I would say that this is a microcosm of a larger debate going across the Arab world, where there are two irreconcilable visions. There are two visions of the state. Is the state going to be controlled by the military? Is the military going to be the dominant power in the state? Or is it going to be controlled, the military, is it going to be subservient, neutral, and controlled by an elected or appointed civilian power that can change, irrespective of whether it's secular or Islamist? The military should always serve, you know, the elected body or the elected executive, irrespective of what it looks like, whether it's got a beard, a shiny face, it doesn't really matter. So I think that's where Libya is, to give you the kind of the broad picture. To go back to the initial point that I was making about where Libya is in terms of its transition, if we go back to 2011, the experience in Libya was radically different to Tunisia and Egypt. In Tunisia and Egypt, it was the protests that really ushered in, the movement, the political movement, and they remained agitated but largely peaceful. There were moments of violence, but in Libya they were almost violent within the first 4 or 5 days, particularly in eastern Libya and Benghazi. That seems to be the marker of Libya, that the peaceful protests and peaceful protesters picked up arms and largely were drawn into a violent confrontation with the state. And I think it's interesting because Hasni reminded me of earlier on, describing that books have been burnt in Libya, and the only book that was really allowed was the Green Book by Gaddafi, the Livre Vert. But this is often something that we look at and we get overconsumed by the catchphrases of Gaddafi. The way that Gaddafi ran the country was a portion of it was through the Green Book, but how did he control Libya? He didn't control it through a book. He controlled it through its tribes and its military. He had delegated authority to tribes in eastern Libya, western Libya, southern Libya. The February 17th revolution dissolved that system of rule. And essentially, the new revolutionary brigades, the new revolutionary armed groups challenged Gaddafi's traditional hold on power through these tribes, and we had a clash that didn't end in 2011. It has continued well after the protests, and even during the first elections in July 2012, when 80% of the electorate voted in Libya's first parliament in over 50 years, there was violence there and a rejection of the elections by a significant portion of tribes who were linked to the former regime and saw democracy as a threat. That didn't go away in 2012. It continued until 2014, when a former general in Gaddafi's army, Khalifa Haftar, emerged in eastern Libya. Actually, he emerged in Tripoli on February 14th in what they call the Valentine's Day coup. That didn't happen. He tried to call for a coup, but didn't have an army, and essentially vanished and emerged 90 days later or 91 days later on May 15th, 2014 in eastern Libya, and called essentially tribes and former regime armed groups to join him in creating the Libyan National Army or the Libyan Arab Armed Forces 1 month before Libya's second elections, and essentially divided the country through civil war, divided it politically, economically, and militarily speaking. And that war has been going on essentially since 2014. The UN attempted to broker a peace deal with one of probably the most interesting, and you can call it crazy, I mean, there are many definitions of this, but essentially by creating a new presidential council in Libya, a 9-man presidency, probably the largest presidency in the world and in history. 9 men led by Prime Minister or President Fayez Sarraj in Tripoli, and including 8 deputy prime ministers or deputy presidents. All of these 8 individuals were not just chosen at random. They weren't just picked out of a hat. They were chosen because they reflected or represented all of these micro conflicts in Libya. You had Islamists, you had secularists, you had tribal figures, you had figures that were involved in the Petroleum Facilities Guard, so they controlled Libya's oil. You had all of these different representatives. And so the logic of the UN was, if Libyans are all fighting for different reasons, tribal reasons, religious reasons, political reasons, greed, grievance, bring them all under one cabinet, controlled by Fayez Sarraj, and they will cooperate. They will compromise and they will cooperate. Essentially, that failed in 2016, the year after they signed the deal, because Khalifa Haftar rejected that deal. He rejected it based on what I've been saying from the beginning of this conversation about power. The presidency is not just a symbolic role. You have many presidents in the world that have a symbolic role, and then the prime minister really controls the rest of it. The presidency in most countries, most presidential systems, are also the supreme commander of the armed forces. The president is the commander of the military, and they have authority over the military. And this is where this power, this conversation about power is so interesting, because Khalifa Haftar, as the chief of the military in the east of the country, rejected a pluralist or an alternative civilian commander over the military. And that has been the central crux of the conflict, of the war over the last 3 years. Essentially, the UN went to a plan B scenario where they took Fayez Sarraj and Khalifa Haftar to Paris in 2017, Abu Dhabi in 2017 and 18, and then Palermo in Italy in 2019 to forge a union between them, to reconfigure the nine-man.
1 minute, Anas.
All right, I'll make it very brief.
Please, conclusion. Yeah, please.
Okay, so essentially that conversation was pushed back in 2019 when Khalifa Haftar tried to overthrow the government of national accord. And then since October of this year, of 2020, the new UN process is trying to remarry a presidential council and the Libyan Arab Armed Forces, or the Libyan National Army. But it comes back to a central question for not only this last decade, but the next decade, which is that the Libyan National Army is essentially going to select its own presidency for this year. Libyan elections will take place, presidential elections will take place in December 2021, and the Libyan people will choose a new president and a new supreme commander of the armed forces. So essentially, next year in the elections, Libyans will choose to replace the LNA, or the Libyan Army's candidate for president, and I think we'll probably go back to a new conflict. But it is symbolic of the wider region. Who is in control of these militaries? Are these militaries going to be the next state? Are they the deep state, as we've seen in Libya? Are they going to be the next state? And I think when we look at the Arab Spring, I would leave with one question. Try to understand the Arab Spring, not only by its ideological colors, but really by this civil-military relations. That's what I think the next decade will be summarized by. Thank you for giving me the additional minute, Hasni. I'll leave it there.
Merci beaucoup, Anas, pour ta présentation. Vous avez remarqué que finalement, les deux cas les plus conflictuels, on a mis plutôt la lumière et on a mis un petit peu l'attention sur les dynamiques locales internes. Et ça, c'est un élément très important, c'est-à-dire en dehors des processus qui sont aujourd'hui en cours. Alors, pour faire le tour, je donne la parole à Brahim Mansour qui a une question sur la Libye qui va la poser à notre invité, Anas Al-Romati. Brahim, c'est à toi la parole.
Ok, bonjour. Je ne sais pas si je lui pose en français ou en anglais, comme il le souhaite.
Tu peux la poser même au kabyle. Oui, il est Dieu.
Comme vous voulez.
Donc, la question sur la Libye serait sur quelles sont les chances de réussite de la conférence de Tunis, du résultat ou les décisions prises lors de la conférence de Tunis, compte tenu du fait que la situation sécuritaire et politique, ou le landscape, le paysage politico-sécuritaire reste pratiquement le même que celui des précédentes conférences, Berlin et autres. Et quel serait peut-être rapidement le poids dans cette équation des tribus connues.
Bref. Bon, je vais essayer de répondre en français, mais avec les éléments anglais aussi.
Et 2 minutes.
Là, que je voulais dire dans mon première parole, c'est que le système sécuritaire en Libye est basé, le système de Khalifa Haftar est le même système de Mohamed Gaddafi, c'est le système Jamahiriya en fait. Ce système est basé dans deux armées irrégulières. Une armée tribaux qui fonctionne comme coup-proofing, et une autre armée, ONU, qui est un Praetorian Guard, un garde prétorien qui est vraiment répondable à la chef de l'armée ou à la chef de l'État. Ce système n'est pas compatible avec la démocratie. Ça fonctionne comme... It only functions purely to preserve an authoritarian system. Ça, c'est la première chose. Et ça, c'est la première menace pour les avenirs. La deuxième chose, c'est que, comme vous avez dit, les conférences à Tunis en ce moment est bloquée dans cette question profonde qui sera le prochain président de la Libye. Les candidats de l'Est, ou bien le candidat de l'armée de Haftar, c'est Aguel Salah. Aguel Salah, c'est les architectes de l'armée. Et c'est cette question qui est un principe qui est plus profonde que juste candidat de l'État. C'est la question, en principe, de les caractères de l'État. Qui va, ou bien dans n'importe quel État dans le monde, est-ce qu'on a un président qui est élu, appointé ou appointed par l'armée? It basically goes against the functional principle of civilian-military relations, about the subservience. Donc, dans mon avis, dans les prochaines années, c'est dans les prochains 2 mois, 3 mois, on va avoir un résultat dans le LPDF, la conférence tunisienne. On va avoir un compromise ou bien un nouveau presidential council. Est-ce qu'on va voir, ou est-ce qu'on va réussir d'avoir une élection, une vraie élection, une élection, à mon avis, which is really like a serious test of public opinion. When Libyans really choose who is the next president, une élection qui va réussir d'avoir ou bien donner les possibilités de le peuple libyen de choisir un président qui est vraiment choisi par les peuples libyens. À mon avis, non. There will be a next conflict or a negotiation entre l'armée et l'État. And there will basically be another war, or at least some more tensions. So I don't think that it's gonna be a success. Sorry for mixing between English and French. It's been quite a while since I've spoken French.
Alors, il y a une question simple de Nesrine qui dit est-ce qu'on peut considérer finalement que le Hirak algérien fait partie du printemps arabe ou non? Même si nous, on a programmé l'Algérie, le Liban, le Soudan dans le prochain panel, donc printemps arabe, acte 2. Alors, Anas.
I'll be very brief. I'll answer the question about Al-Hirak, which I think is a fascinating one, because Algeria is the kind of the unique exception. I've spent little time, but I have spent time in Algeria, meeting Algerians and listening to how they view the experience in Libya and elsewhere. I think the first thing is that Libyans and Algerians have a lot in common in terms of their expectations. Most of the Arab Spring is based on ripping down the state, right? But Algerians and Libyans are in this kind of bizarre position because they have oil. So Libyans also, and Algerians, in my view, want more state, not less state. They were asking for, more jobs and more public spending by the government. So it's a very strange position when you look at Libya and Algeria in contrast to the rest of the Arab Spring. I would also say that the unique part of Algeria is that the Algerian memory is quite strong, and they don't want to go back, at least from my experience of speaking to Algerians, they don't want to go back to the 1990s. So when they're thinking of revolution and they're thinking of reform, I don't think that they want to go into armed conflict in Algeria. They want to avoid the Libyan experience. They also want to avoid their experience in the 90s. So I think, as Khadija was saying earlier on, I think it's going to be a very long journey, which will be a test of resilience to the Algerian state and its ability to reform in a meaningful way. And I think that's really the question that, again, is about the Arab Spring, whether we're talking about Libya and Egypt and Tunisia and Syria and Yemen in the first club of the Arab Spring, or the second wave of we're seeing, with Sudan, with Lebanon, with Iraq. I think what's really interesting is how resilient are these regimes? And when the military is in charge, and that is really the question that Farah was asking, we're not just talking about a small segment of the population, we're not talking about a small part of the state. We're talking about the military, we're talking about the intelligence, we're talking about so much of the public economy. And so as a club, how creative are they? Are they capable of responding to modern challenges? The best example is COVID. How many of these military states have been able to respond in a meaningful way to COVID? None of them, in my opinion. So I think they're going to face more challenges. Those challenges are opportunities for civil society to turn around and say, we're not happy and we need change. I don't think in the long run, over the next decade, that the military regimes are going to be able to survive because they don't have a culture of creative thinking. They don't have a culture of what do you think and what do you think and how can we overcome this? The culture in the military is very simple. You take an order and you shut up. And I think that's the problem. So I'll leave it there for my intervention because I don't want to go over my 2 minutes. But there's a lot more to come, I would say. The next decade will most likely be more colorful than the last decade.
Merci beaucoup pour celles et ceux qui nous ont suivis de 10h30, de 12h30 jusqu'à maintenant. Je vous souhaite de très, très, très bonnes fêtes et on se verra début janvier avec donc des nouvelles thématiques et avec de nouveaux invités. Merci beaucoup et à très bientôt.